Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're the place where we take the sources you give us, really unpack them, and give you that shortcut to being genuinely well-informed.
Exactly. Think of it as your way to quickly get a handle on complex stuff. We're basically your guides through the material you wanted explored.
And today, oh, this is a good one, we're diving into some really fascinating source material. Excerpts from H.G. Wells's A Modern Utopia.
Yeah, and it's not your typical report or, dry analysis. It's structured like a story, a narrative journey, almost like a philosophical travelogue, really.
Right, that's a good way to put it.
And Wells, he did that deliberately.
So the sources, they follow these two travelers. One's the author, Wells himself, basically, and his friend, a botanist.
Yeah.
And they're suddenly sort of zapped from a mountaintop in the Alps.
And boom, they land on this planet. It looks just like Earth, physically identical, but the society, politics, economics, completely different. A whole other world built on the same ground.
So our mission for this deep dive is to kind of walk alongside them through these source excerpts. We want to pull out the really striking bits of this imagined utopia, figure out the thinking behind it all.
And crucially, see what actually happens when, human nature, personal baggage, Earth problems, when they bump up against this supposedly perfect system.
Yeah, it's like exploring perfection, but through very human eyes, right? How does that ideal filter through actual experience?
That's the core of it, as Wells presents it in the sources.
Okay, so let's get into it. Wells, he kicks things off by explaining why he wrote this. It wasn't just, for a bit of fun.
No, not at all. He mentions grappling with this muddle in his own mind, basically confusion about social and political stuff that kept cropping up in his other writings. He felt his earlier attempts to tackle it directly just hadn't quite worked.
Right. He figured a straightforward essay, laying out arguments might be too dry, maybe miss the subtleties he wanted to get at.
Exactly. So he went for this story format, like a cinematograph entertainment, he calls it. Using the travelers lets him explore ideas with what he terms a lucid vagueness.
Lucid vagueness, I like that.
Yeah, it lets him paint this big picture without having to nail down every single tiny detail rigidly. It feels more real that way somehow.
So picture it, 1 minute, Alps, crisp mountain air. The next, you're just somewhere else entirely, a whole new planet.
And Wells makes a key point early on. For a modern utopia, you need the whole planet. It can't be some hidden valley or secret island anymore.
Why is that?
Because, he argues, the modern world is too interconnected. There's no place on Earth truly isolated enough to build a completely separate, self-contained, perfect society. It has to be global or nothing.
Okay, that makes sense. So physically, it's Earth's twin. Same geography, same mountains, oceans.
Oh, it's identical map. But right away, they notice these small but really significant differences. Language is one of the first things.
Oh, right. How does that work?
Well, the sources say there's one single language across the whole planet, no translation needed. But interestingly,
What?
Wells says it's still a living tongue. It's got imperfections, it's evolving, it's not some perfectly engineered static code. It still feels, human, messy even.
And their money? The cash they had in their pockets.
Totally useless. British banknotes are, and I quote, negotiable only at a practically infinite distance. Suddenly, they're broke in this new world.
Which immediately highlights something fundamental Wells wants to show, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Older utopias in fiction often felt closed off, maybe even hostile to strangers. Wells flips that. His utopia is fundamentally open.
So you can just wander around.
Pretty much. The sources emphasize this freedom of movement. No language issues stopping you, no currency exchange hassles, no weird local customs or laws tripping you up from place to place.
And what's the thinking behind that, according to Wells?
He suggests this total accessibility prevents the kind of clumping you see on Earth, where everyone piles into a few desirable spots, often overwhelming them. Here, people can spread out naturally.
Travel itself sounds transformed, too.
Oh, completely. No more dirty, smoky steam trains. Wells calls them already doomed on Earth, even back then.
So what do they have instead?
Smooth, quiet, roomy trains. Almost like comfortable clubs on wheels, the sources say. Open plan, no class distinctions at all.
Nice. And other transport.
Widespread motor cars, lots of cycle tracks built along scenic routes, not just next to roads, and tons of footpaths. It's all about easy, pleasant movement.
And this freedom ties into a bigger principle Wells is keen on, liberty.
Yes, he sees liberty as, quote, the very substance of life. It's essential for individuality to, breathe and develop.
But surely there has to be limits. You can't just do anything.
Right. And Wells acknowledges that because we live together in society, individual will has to fall short of absolute freedom. The state's job, in his view, is to find that balance.
Balancing individual desire with the needs of the group.
Exactly. And that balance is often maintained by, as he puts it, prohibitions, rules. So liberty isn't chaos, it's a structure that allows maximum individual freedom without harming others or the collective.
Okay, so they're starting to get a feel for the place. What about the actual environment? Buildings, homes?
The sources describe things as very clean, very simple, designed to minimize labor. Think. No dusty fireplaces, they use radiant heat instead. Rounded corners, not sharp angles that collect dirt. Metal frames, easy to clean.
Practical. And the cleanliness, does it just encourage?
More than encourage. There's a mention of the price at an inn being doubled if you don't leave the washroom exactly as you found it. There are expectations.
Wow. Okay, Wells also makes a point about beauty, doesn't he? The look of the place.
He does, and it's quite insightful. He says the beauty of their infrastructure, trams, roads, bridges, isn't just decoration added on later. It actually comes from having a good social organization in the first place.
As opposed to
the ugliness he sees in many things on Earth, which he thinks are made in an underbred, strenuous manner, a result of our chaotic, competitive way of doing things.
So social harmony leads to physical beauty in the environment. That's quite a thought.
It is. He also mentions that utopian art tends to be kinetic and momentary, not static, maybe reflecting a society that values process and flow.
Interesting. Now, with all this freedom of movement, what about privacy? Can you just walk into anyone's house?
No, definitely not. The sources are clear. Private space is strongly protected. Your room, your apartment, your house, that's your domain.
But there's a catch, isn't there?
Yeah.
Regarding land.
Yes. Private territory beyond the house itself, big gardens, yards, estates, that's treated differently. It's limited and taxed quite heavily.
Howling.
The tax goes up, quote, as the square of the area affected. The idea is to stop people walling off huge chunks of land for purely private use.
Why that specific approach?
Wells frames it as a quantitative question. It's not banning private gardens, but managing land use through detailed local rules rather than one big absolute law, finding that balance again.
Okay, let's switch gears a bit. Economics. How does money work here? We know it exists. They found that lion coin.
Right, so it's not pure communism or anything. Money is definitely a thing. But the basis of its value is completely different from Earth.
Not gold.
Nope. Gold isn't especially valued. The standard, the sources state clearly, is energy. Units of energy.
Energy, how does that work?
Local authorities issue energy notes, basically currency, backed by the available energy surpluses in their region.
And since it's one world state.
There's no international trade in the way we think of it, no complex currency exchange rates between nations.
What's the insight Wells is offering here? Why energy?
He seems to see Earth's economics as a mess, tangled up with politics, nationalism, just bad psychology. Basing value on something physical and universal like energy is his attempt to create a more rational, objective system.
Separating the physical reality of resources from the human elements of labor and distribution.
Kind of, yeah. He wants to separate physical economics, energy, resources from what he calls labor economics, things like division of labor, wages, education, freedom.
That's a really radical concept.
Yeah.
So energy notes are the currency. What about owning things? Property.
Property is described as plastic and fluctuating, not fixed and absolute, like often on Earth. There are sort of two main types.
Okay, what's the first?
Personal stuff. Your clothes, your books, furniture, tools, maybe a bike, even your house falls into this category. These things are considered inalienable. You own them fully.
So you can give them away, lend them, leave them to someone when you die.
Yep, all of that, though there might be a small fee for inheritance transfer. You can also save up your energy notes, maybe for your children's education, that kind of thing.
And the second type of property.
That gets scantier respect, as the sources put it. Things like shares in big companies or access to resources, and crucially, land itself.
Oh.
And natural resources, raw materials. These are the inalienable property of the world state, always.
So you can't own land.
You can lease it, use it, but only for a maximum term, say 50 years, according to the excerpts. The underlying ownership always stays with the collective world state.
To prevent
Individuals or groups accumulating vast permanent control over the fundamental resources everyone needs. It keeps things circulating.
Okay, that makes sense within their system. What about work? Is it all automated?
A lot of the irksome labors, the drudgery, yes, that's handled by machinery. But people still work, and the state plays a key role here.
How so?
It acts as the reserve employer, basically a safety net. It guarantees a minimum wage job to anyone who needs one, enough for a decent standard of living.
Doing what kind of work?
Often necessary, perhaps less glamorous mechanical tasks. But the sources stress this isn't seen as charity, it's a public service, part of the social contract.
And Wells argues that constant idleness isn't desirable anyway.
Right, he suggests permanent idleness leads to misery. People need purpose. So how do they match people to jobs across this whole planet? They have a system. The state tracks labor needs globally. There are maps in public offices, updated daily apparently, showing where workers are needed.
Like a giant job board.
Exactly. And if you're unemployed, you get travel passes and coupons to go where the work is.
How do they keep track of everyone?
Through universal registration, everyone is indexed. It even includes taking thumb marks.
Universal registration with biometrics. That sounds intense.
Yeah.
Very thorough.
It is. The sources do mention that inherited wealth still exists, allowing some people a life of ease. Wells suggests a certain amount of this is actually seen as beneficial for society, maybe allowing for innovation or art.
So it's not about absolute equality of outcome.
Doesn't seem like it. The goal seems more about changing the reasons people strive, shifting the struggle away from basic survival, panic, and fear.
Which are addressed by the minimum wage and state employment.
Right, and shifting it towards higher motivations, ambition, creativity, imagination, things that can flourish when basic needs are met.
Our travelers, the narrator and the botanist, they actually try this work thing out, don't they?
They do. They end up doing some hand-finishing work on wooden toys, adding personality machines can't replicate, working for the minimum wage.
And how do they find it?
They work by the hour, though apparently it's not super strictly enforced, and they report feeling this curious contentment, surprisingly, despite the low pay.
But there's always a but.
But the narrator, the author figure, also feels kind of swallowed up, lost in the daily routine. He feels it's making him lose his bigger perspective, his ability to really see and analyze Utopia as a whole.
That's fascinating. Even in Utopia, the grind can get you down, or at least narrow your focus.
It seems so. Which brings us to a really difficult aspect. Wells tackles. What about the people who just don't fit in? Or who actively cause harm? The failures?
Yeah, what does Utopia do with, say, congenital invalids, people with severe mental disabilities, criminals, the hopelessly stupid, as Wells puts it?
Well, the baseline security is there, the minimum wage, the reserve employment. But for those Wells considers deliberate failures, criminals, the solution described is segregation.
Segregation?
Yes, on islands.
Yeah.
Kept physically separate from the main population.
What about punishment? Jails? Execution?
The sources explicitly say no killing, except maybe in the case of severely deformed infants at birth, and no jails. Wells argues humans aren't good enough to run jails without becoming tyrants themselves.
So these islands, what are they like for the people sent there?
They're given, quote, just as full a liberty as they can have. Basically, they live their lives but apart. State intervention is minimal, only stepping in to prevent serious cruelty amongst themselves.
And Wells presents this as the only real alternative.
He frames it as the only choice besides either constantly tormenting these individuals within the main society or simply killing them off. It's a pretty stark view.
Definitely a challenging part of his vision. Now, back to our travelers. They have a run-in with the system when they need work, right?
They do. They go to a public office, which doubles as the post office and labor exchange, and they get asked for their number or their scientific name.
Which is based on?
Their unique profile thumb marks, physical traits, the universal registration index.
But they don't have one, obviously. How do they react?
They try to kind of bluff, act vague, which immediately makes the official suspicious. He gets quite grave and even suggests they might have escaped from one of those islands.
So this interaction really shows that registration system in action. Wells calls it organized clairvoyance, doesn't he?
Yes, this central index, constantly updated with biometric data, distributed locally, complete visibility.
How did Wells feel about that kind of surveillance?
He notes that old-fashioned liberals, people who are reflexively against the government on principle, would hate it. But he argues it's just essential for good, efficient, modern government. You need the data.
And then comes the big twist in this scene.
Huge twist. The official takes their thumb marks and identifies them, but not as utopians.
How?
He matches their prints to records from Earth. He knows who they are on Earth and even where their earthly counterparts were just days before the narrator was apparently in Norway.
Whoa, so they're not just travelers, they're duplicates, echoes.
It throws everything into question. Are they real in this utopia? Are they apparitions? Projections somehow linked across dimensions? It reveals this unexpected, deep connection between utopia and their own world.
Mind-bending stuff. Okay, stepping back from the plot mechanics, Wells uses these observations to paint a picture of the results of this utopian system. What's the general vibe?
The sources talk about the visible order, the cleanliness, the way people carry themselves with a free carriage and graciousness.
And Wells sees this not as superficial manners, but as
evidence of something deeper.
Yeah.
Underlying discipline, a collective triumph over egoism driven by shared devotion, foresight, and trust. It's not accidental, he stresses, and it's not forced by a dictator. It's the result of a gigantic process of cooperation over time.
He also doesn't shy away from controversial topics like population.
No, he dives right in. He basically accepts the Malthusian argument that unchecked population growth, like on Earth, inevitably leads to misery and scarcity.
So Utopia's solution.
State intervention in parentage, explicitly aiming to prevent weaklings being born, as the text puts it.
Wow.
There are minimum qualifications, physical and mental, required for marriage and parenting. If you're deemed below that standard, Wells says, you shouldn't have children.
And if someone below the standard does have children, or has children with significant diseases or disabilities,
The state steps in to provide an absolutely effectual guarantee they won't offend again.
which sounds like
The implication seems to be sterilization, though it's not explicitly spelled out in the excerpts we have. Wells contrasts this, however harsh, with the suffering and neglect seen in Earth's slums and asylums. He frames it as a difficult necessity for the greater good.
leading to what kind of outcome?
The expectation is incredibly low child mortality, like 99 out of 100 children surviving to old age.
Moving on to relationships. Marriage, gender.
Wells' Modern Utopia aims to equalize things between the sexes. Motherhood, if done well, is treated as a valued profession in itself.
How does that work practically?
Married women, or mothers needing to provide care, are actually forbidden from doing industrial work unless they can hire qualified substitutes to handle the childcare or domestic duties.
What's the intended effect of that?
Wells argues it helps eliminate prostitution because women aren't forced into it economically. It also stops marriage being just a way for women to sell themselves for financial security.
How does marriage itself work?
It starts with a public declaration of intent, then there's a waiting period for reflection. Divorce is possible for incompatibility without social stigma. There's a specific rule mentioned about fidelity, though.
Oh.
A wife's infidelity is treated as a public offense, not just a private matter between the couple. The reasoning given is that the state itself is harmed by it. Marriage is ideally seen as lasting until the children are grown.
What about living arrangements? Is it all nuclear families?
Seems much more flexible. The traditional household unit is less central because things like hotels, clubs, and various cooperative living arrangements are common.
So you might live.
Well-off utopians, the sources suggest, often belong to residential clubs with private suites. Cooperatives are popular for things like farming. It suggests a society less reliant on the isolated family home.
Okay, so we have this complex world, energy currency, population controls, specific social norms. Who's actually in charge? Who runs this place?
That brings us to the samurai.
The samurai, like the Japanese warriors.
Same name, but a different concept here. They are the governing class. Political power, administration, elections, it's almost entirely in their hands.
Is it hereditary? How do you become one?
It's a voluntary order. You can choose to join, typically around age 25, though you can start adhering to the rules earlier.
What are the requirements?
You need to pass college-level exams, which, interestingly, Wells says most utopians are capable of passing, and you have to know 2 specific sets of literature. Yep. The first canon, the great established works of the past, and the second canon, current works, may be considered less classic or still developing.
Why the reading list?
The idea, according to the sources, is to create a shared intellectual background, a common tone of thought among those who govern.
But it's not just about exams and reading, is it? There's a strict code.
Oh, very strict. The rule of life for the samurai includes a long list of prohibitions.
Like what?
No alcohol, no drugs, no smoking, no betting, no lending money at interest, no playing games for stakes. They can't be primarily involved in trade, and they can't employ personal servants.
Wow. Why ban all those? Well, small pleasures and common activities.
Wells's rationale seems to be twofold. First, it weeds out certain personality types who wouldn't thrive under such restrictions. Second, it acts as a check on basic human instincts for pleasure, for dominance, for acquisition that he believed could derail society if unchecked among the rulers, citing historical examples from Earth.
What about personal life, relationships?
There's a rule of chastity, which means faithfulness within marriage, but it's specifically not a rule of celibacy. Samurai can and do marry.
But if they marry.
Both partners have to adhere to the samurai rule. If one partner breaks the rule, they have to leave either their partner or the order itself.
Are women part of this order too?
Yes, absolutely. Both men and women can be samurai. And women under the rule, or a slightly less strict lesser rule, have a specific way of dressing.
Like a uniform.
Sort of. Either the standard male uniform or a specific style of high-waisted woolen dress with their hair coiled up. Wells explicitly calls this a sumptuary law.
Meaning
Meaning it's designed to limit extravagance and, as he saw it, the kind of excessive focus on ornamentation and fashion competition among women on Earth.
and religion.
Spirituality.
The samurai are forbidden from using temples or priests. The rule is they must worship alone, or maybe with just one other person. The focus is on silent and deliberate reflections.
Interesting. Very individualistic spirituality for the ruling class. And then there's perhaps the most striking requirement of all for them, the annual pilgrimage.
Ah, yes. Tell us about that.
Every single samurai, every year, must spend at least 7 consecutive days completely alone.
Alone where?
In the wilderness, mountains, desert, out at sea, some wild, solitary place, and they can't take books, weapons, writing materials, or any money, just basic provisions.
7 days alone, with nothing but your thoughts and nature. Why?
The sources say the purpose is profound, to be alone with nature, necessity, and their own thoughts. To gain perspective, step away from the bustle of ruling, and contemplate the great external things, space, time, eternity, God. It's seen as absolutely essential for keeping them grounded and wise.
A mandatory reset button for the rulers. That's quite an image.
It really is. But as we get towards the end of the excerpts, this carefully constructed utopian bubble starts to feel fragile, at least for the travelers.
What happens?
They're walking, taking it all in, and suddenly the botanist sees someone familiar.
From Utopia.
No. From Earth. It's a woman he apparently had a failed romance with back home. And she's there, in Utopia, with the very man she ended up marrying on Earth, someone the botanist really dislikes.
Oof. That's gotta hurt.
Yeah.
In the middle of paradise.
Exactly. He completely loses it. He's consumed by jealousy, anger. All the old earthly emotions come flooding back. He sees it as some kind of cruel joke, blames the narrator, and insists they have to leave Utopia now.
How does the narrator react?
He tries to be rational. He argues, maybe people are different here. Maybe the utopian system has changed them. This feeling you have, it's just an earth scar, old baggage.
But the botanist isn't having it.
Not at all. He's completely overwhelmed by his personal pain. He shouts something like, "What are we all but scars? What is life but scarring? We are the scars of the crash." His unresolved past just shatters the whole utopian illusion for him. And then, bam, just like that, the scene dissolves. They're instantly back, not in the Alps, but on a busy, dirty, noisy London street.
Talk about whiplash.
Total whiplash. The sources paint this vivid picture. The fog, the noise, a draggled prostitute, people swearing, the chaos of the crowd, nearly getting hit by an umbrella.
The raw reality of Earth hits them.
Hits them hard. The botanist basically says, we can't even talk about utopia here. The sheer, overwhelming, re-echoing actualities of London just crush the fragile utopian vision they were holding on to.
So the narrator is left reflecting on this clash.
Yes. He realizes that creating and holding onto that utopian vision takes real mental effort, an act of will and imagination. It's built from the stuff of the real world, but shaped differently.
And it's hard to keep both in focus.
Incredibly hard, he finds. The ideal vision and the messy reality seem to fight each other in his mind. He also wonders if the sheer scale and complexity of the utopian system might just be too big for individuals, even utopian ones, or maybe especially apparitions like them, to fully grasp and sustain mentally.
Before we wrap up, Wells adds a bit of philosophy at the end, doesn't he? In an appendix.
He does, briefly touching on how we even think about these things.
What's his point there?
He contrasts science, which starts with concrete things and builds towards abstract ideas, with a lot of traditional philosophy, which often starts with the big abstract concepts. And he's actually quite skeptical of our basic mental tools.
Skeptical of logic and language.
Pretty much. He calls them the instrument of thought and argues they inherently distort reality
How so?
by lumping unique individual things into vague categories, by treating negatives like darkness being the absence of light as if they were positive things in themselves, and by mixing up ideas from different levels of reality, like applying physics concepts directly to social interactions.
So what does that mean for things like morality or faith?
He seems to suggest they might be less about finding objective, provable truths for everyone and more like forms of self-expression similar to art that come from deep self-knowledge. Things you know or feel are right for you, but can't necessarily prove scientifically to someone else.
Wow. Okay, so that was quite the journey through the sources you brought us, from those peaks in the Alps to this intricate planet-wide society, energy money, state-controlled parenting, those samurai pilgrims.
Yeah, we've seen Wells wrestle with enormous ideas. City planning, property law, marriage, social control, even the very way our minds work and might limit us.
This deep dive into A Modern Utopia really gives you a feel for a vision that's incredibly ambitious, almost audacious in its design.
But also deeply human in how it plays out, right? With all the bumps and contradictions, like the botanist's earth scar completely derailing his experience.
It really pushes you to question your assumptions about everything: success, failure, freedom, what a good society even looks like, and maybe even how reliable our own thinking is when we try to imagine these things.
Exactly. Hopefully, exploring these sources together has pulled out some of those core ideas, those memorable details, and maybe sparked some aha moments for you, making sense of this complex vision quickly.
Wells paints this detailed picture, but ultimately it seems to highlight just how hard it is to hold on to a perfect ideal when faced with messy reality.
And his final thoughts suggest maybe the biggest roadblock isn't a lack of good ideas for a better world.
But maybe the limitations built into the very tools we use, our minds, our language, the way we categorize and perceive reality.
So here's a final thought to chew on, straight from reflecting on these sources. Could it be that the greatest obstacle to building that better world isn't the shortage of grand plans, but rather the inherent flaws and biases within the instruments, our own minds, that we rely on to dream them up and put them into practice?